Hi, I'm Uwana Ikaiddi. I'm the Developer Documentation Manager at BigCommerce, and today I will be talking to you about how to improve your developer documentation from the inside out. So our first question here is, what do we mean when we're talking about developer documentation? And this has become a bit more of a complex question as the documentation landscape has continued to change over the years. Previously, developer documentation only referred to API reference material. However, developer documentation isn't just limited to reference material anymore. Since the advent of developer portals and focus on the developer experience, developer documentation has become a mix of both reference and conceptual information that allows organizations to provide an enjoyable developer experience when onboarding newcomers to their API. So the point of developer documentation now is to hasten the time that it takes for a new developer to become proficient and promote extended use of APIs, SDKs, and other tools that are provided by an organization. And our next and possibly most important question is, who is your audience? And we have to think about this anytime we're talking about any type of content. And here, we expect that because our docs are external, our audience would then be external, which is a correct assumption in many ways. However, just because your docs are external doesn't mean that your audience is exclusively external. Docs meant for one group can also be used by another for a multitude of reasons. I guarantee that you have an internal audience for your developer documentation as well. In many cases in organizations, technical writers are the only group who has taken the time to gather and arrange certain information in an easily consumable manner. While this is useful for external readers, it can also benefit those within the organization as well. In many cases, it can act as the prime source of truth because it's external facing and it offers information when you don't have easy access to additional contexts, such as subject matter experts in a particular field. So as we go through this talk, we'll take it step by step, starting with how to identify your internal audience and then soliciting internal feedback from that internal audience. Then we'll go on to how to collect external feedback and then how to apply feedback in a way that will enhance your developer documentation. So our first step is to identify your internal audience. So as I was saying before, you have more internal readers than you realize because developer documentation is a very easy and accessible way to understand what's going on in terms of your organization's API or other tool information in a very easily digestible way. So one example of people who might be using your developer documentation are your internal developers. When it comes to creating tools that utilize your APIs, such as SDKs, API clients, toolkits, starter apps, it's important for your developers to have an understanding of not only what is available that they can use, but what kind of information would be available to the external developers that would be using these tools. It gives them the confidence that the outside developers will have the context that they need to best utilize the tools that they're developing for them. Then there are support agents. So here we have customer support, product support engineers, and solution architects, all of whom interact directly with external consumers or developers depending on the tier of the request. So customer support usually acts as first tier, and them being familiar with your documentation allows them to guide customers appropriately. Someone calls in and has a question that's more so on the developer side, but can be answered easily by your documentation. Your customer support, knowing that that information is available, is a great way to allow them to point these customers in the right direction. Along with that is the product support engineers who usually support specifically developer questions, and them knowing what information is available for your documentation allows them to go more in depth when helping developers and customers with developer-like questions, and then leave them with certain types of examples or use cases that are available there for them to go off of once the support call is done. Then there are solutions architects, which create custom solutions for your customers or your developers or even potentially partners of your organization. And they need to know what tools are available, and that allows them to create custom solutions that are still manageable for the customers who they've created that solution for. And there are many more: marketing, sales and sales engineering, product manager. Basically, anyone who's talking about your APIs to external audiences should be aware of your documentation and what is contained within. So how do you find out who is actually currently using your docs internally? A great question to ask is, who's asking about you? Who's interacting with you? So finding out and paying attention to who's contacting your team regularly, engaging in conversations about documentation with you, or even asking questions directly to the documentation team about how to address certain questions or whether there is information about a certain topic. All of these people are those who are actively right now interacting with your documentation. There is also documentation change requests in whatever form they come to you. So if there's someone or a certain team that's creating tickets to request documentation changes, or even teams that are tagging tickets with labels to indicate that the change that's outlined in the ticket would be affecting documentation in one way or another, are people who are aware and actively engaged in the documentation that you maintain. There are also go-to-market meetings and release meetings. Pay attention to who's inviting you to these team meetings in regards to new features. Or even once you're in these meetings, pay attention to who brings up the status and progress of documentation in meetings, or who wants to ensure that the docs are working cohesively with the rest of the messaging that's being output by the organization. These are also people to pay attention to, because they're paying attention to your documentation. So you'll definitely want to utilize them as potential sources for internal feedback. Now that you know who's currently aware of your docs, who should you be making aware of your docs who might not necessarily know about them right now? At the top of this list is developer advocates or your developer relations team. It's very important for them, since they are your primary interaction or your proxy interaction with developers who are using your products, for them to understand what your organization can provide to them in the form of documentation and support when it comes to them wanting to potentially build on your platform or utilize your tools. Another team that is very important for them to know the status of documentation and what's getting updated is the learning development or training portion of your organization. In some cases, the training organization is putting together specialized trainings, sometimes specifically for developers who want to enhance their knowledge and their skills at working directly on your platform or with your product. So making sure that any update to the documentation is then reflected in any training materials is of the utmost importance. And in addition to that, anyone who uses or discusses APIs regularly should really be brought into the loop when it comes to developer documentation, and should be giving you feedback on things that they're noticing about the documentation or things that they would like to see. Now we'll discuss soliciting internal feedback. So first thing that can be done here is creating communication channels that are specifically for your documentation. In most cases, this can be a Slack channel or a Teams channel, anything like that. And what this allows is for people to ask questions about the documentation, make documentation update requests all in one in one localized place, and then facilitate initial discussion about documentation content. The useful aspect of this is that not only does it bring attention to your documentation and brings in people who are interested or are interacting or are just even curious about your documentation and allows them to discuss, it also gets to a point where people who are familiar enough with your documentation can actually act as sources of help in these channels. So someone who's a little bit newer to the documentation might come in and ask a question or make an update request, and someone else can chime in, whether it's from the documentation team or not. Someone else can chime in and say, oh, we actually don't need to do that because we have a section about that right here. So it's a very useful way to not only bring more attention to your documentation, but also solicit feedback in a more organic way. And then also let people know about all of the different aspects of the documentation that are available. There's also the option to create documentation JIRA projects and labels. Tagging work that will affect external documentation, as we were talking about before, is a very important and great way to make sure that the appropriate changes are being made to the documentation as changes are being made to the product or tool. Also, having people submit tickets specifically to address changes to the documentation is another great way. It's another way to make sure that things aren't falling through the cracks and your team is able to stay up to date with all of the changes that are happening. The third is regular meetings with key stakeholders. So this is another great way to keep up to date with coming changes and maybe give you a bit more lead time and understanding of the feedback that you're getting from these meetings. It allows you and your team to understand what content needs to be included with upcoming changes based on the product feature or new tool that is coming out, and making sure that it melds with the developer experience as a whole, making sure that if there is marketing aspects that are involved, developer relations, maybe an announcement blog, all of that can be combined with new documentation to bolster the developer experience, make it easier to onboard onto this new feature, a new API endpoint, anything like that, and make sure that all of the subsequent content, the marketing content, the developer relations content, all links back to the actual developer documentation, which is what's going to empower your developers to onboard onto this new tool or feature. So while all of this is going on, it's very important to keep all information in one place to track quantity and quality. So this is a very important aspect because in some cases, messy feedback is almost as bad as not having feedback at all. So be sure to keep track of, for example, how many times a request has been made, along with an assessment of what kind of quality improvement would be provided by implementing a change. This is very important to assess because not all feedback is created equal. So it's very important to make sure that you're assessing the need and the possible contribution to the documentation that each piece of feedback would bring. Next, we'll talk about collecting external feedback. So a couple of things to keep in mind when it comes to collecting external feedback. One thing is that unlike your internal audience that you have direct access to, can ask questions about and understand what challenges and goals they're trying to achieve or overcome, you don't necessarily have that luxury with your external audience because there's a right side more of them in most cases, and you don't have a direct way to speak with all of them and understand what all of them are trying to achieve or what frustrations all of them might be having. So one way to overcome this is to establish audience personas. So a persona is a fictional representation of users that might interact with a certain product in a similar way across the board. It's predominantly used in marketing, but can be very useful when trying to understand any external audience. And here, the product that your persona would be interacting with is your documentation. So this is very useful when keeping different audiences in mind. Here I have an example of one of our developer personas that we have at BigCommerce, and this is just a breakdown of our fictional person, Grant, a little bit about his background and some of the language and tools that he uses frequently. In this next section here, we break down his behaviors and goals and frustrations, and this is really an amalgamation of common frustration, goals, and behavior we foresee for someone of the junior developer status to have. Even though we're focusing very much so on a developer persona here, external documentation is not just for developers. There are plenty of other types of positions and roles that will look at developer documentation to seek some kind of information to achieve a certain goal. So you can create a persona for each one of those foreseen roles or personas that are associated with the roles, just to get a better idea of what your external audience potentially looks like and what the diversity in that audience is. So a great team to work with when creating personas like these is the developer advocates or developer relations team. Like I said before, they're going to have direct contact with the people who are going to be interacting with tools, with your APIs, with your documentation, so they can give a little bit more insight into the goals and frustrations that your audience might be having and the different personas that you could possibly create. Support agents are also a great resource because they can provide common use cases and also common frustrations or common goals that developers that they've spoken with have tried to achieve, and you can definitely incorporate that into developing your own persona. Next, we'll talk about creating a singular place to collect feedback. And this is very important considering the potential size of the audience and the fact that that audience will grow over time. So settling on one place where you'd like direct external audience to submit feedback is very important because it helps create a habit and an understanding and a predictable pattern of what it looks like to reach out to your team, the developer documentation team, with feedback about the documentation. So one common way to do this for those who host their developer documentation on GitHub is to open up GitHub issues, link out from specific pages in your documentation, and allow your external audience to provide feedback on those specific pages as GitHub issues. Another way to collect feedback is just using a feedback form directly embedded on the page. This can take the form of was this page helpful or not, or a 5-star rating, and then allowing, depending on the rating or the thumbs up or thumbs down, people to provide extra information about what's working for them, what isn't, what feedback they have for the documentation as a whole, or what sections they wish they could see and can't see right now or aren't available. The last thing to keep in mind here is assessment of the feedback. So make sure that you're structuring and giving information that allows your external audience to provide you with feedback that you can actually act on. So assessing whether the feedback is helpful, if it's sufficiently broad as to warrant being added into external facing documentation, and whether the information in and of itself is actionable. Making sure that the external audience can provide information such as what kind of feedback is this? Is it praise? Is it a request for a new section of the documentation, or even if it's more so of a support question? In those cases, you can guide them towards support, but it's still a good way to capture as much feedback as possible and get your audience comfortable with the idea of giving you feedback. So that being said, about trying to collect all of this information in one place when it comes to external audiences, know that you will receive feedback about your documentation from multiple areas. So any place where you have an established online community or established online presence, you're going to be getting feedback. This could be a Slack community for your organization. It could be in Stack Overflow if you're very active in answering questions about your product or features, or just on Twitter if your developer relations team maintains an active Twitter. All of those places are opportunities for your external audience to reach out to you about documentation. So it's a very good way to get candid feedback, but it requires a lot of maintenance and work. Making sure to check on all of these different touch points requires a lot of time and resources, so keep that in mind. The best advice that I can provide here is to work with your developer advocates or developer relations and the community managers to catch these instances of feedback about documentation, and then also gently direct your audience towards your established feedback collection mechanisms. And then on the off chance that you're getting this feedback from any of these places that I had mentioned, from Slack, from Stack Overflow, from Twitter, things like that, converting that feedback into that same format will help with assessing the quantity and quality of the feedback itself. So now we'll delve into applying feedback. So now that you have your internal and external feedback, you'll find in a lot of cases some common types of feedback that you'll be getting. From the internal side, a lot of it's going to be about incomplete information, and that is to say information where you've provided a certain amount of context and information about a topic, and the internal team will know that there's a little bit more that can be said, so they recommend adding more. Also, there is the not up to date feedback where some kind of change happened or a feature was added that the documentation team wasn't aware of, and you're needing to bring that up to date. And then also best practices and troubleshooting. So this is insight that people from your internal teams in different departments can get by perhaps working more directly with developers and knowing what kind of snags they're running into and creating troubleshooting around that, or best practices that they want to keep in mind to keep those snags from happening. Then also on the external side, there not being enough content about a specific concept. That is very useful information because it tells you about where and what your external audience is wanting to see and how many people in your external audience are wanting to see that. Next is the inability to find certain information. What this usually takes the form of is someone is going and looking for information in a certain place, they're not finding it, but they feel intuitively that's where that information should be, so you get feedback about it, and that really tells you that that would be some interesting information to add in that specific place, or if that information exists in the documentation but people aren't navigating there and they feel that that information should be in a different spot, relocating it or making it more visible so that people are able to find what they're looking for more easily. And the third here is popular use cases that aren't covered. So that is discussing that there are maybe common ways that your external audience has been using some of your APIs or tools, and there just isn't a documentation on a set kind of base way to do that, which is causing developers to have to reinvent the wheel over and over again when it's not necessary. So when it comes to assessing feedback, most times different types of feedback don't interfere, and that's to say that internal and external feedback aren't really clashing with each other. So in this case, it's not really necessary to have to weigh one way or the other, whether to put in this external feedback or to implement this internal feedback that you received. You can usually do both. However, just because you've received feedback doesn't mean that it's something that you need to implement. And that's really where the quality and quantity aspects of this feedback come into play. Understanding what kind of quality increase the documentation will have by including this information is very important to take into account, as well as how many times a certain change has been asked for. Taking these two things into account is a good way to make decisions about what feedback to act on and what to leave aside. So in some cases, in most cases, this has to do with internal documentation or internal feedback about documentation. There are calls to increase the amount of information that is provided in documentation, but it might end up hindering the effectiveness of the overall external documentation, particularly for the external audience. So in cases like these, it is useful to consider creating a new internal doc set that includes this information that is useful more so internally than externally. So if this does happen, what you need to keep in mind is that it does create a new doc set for the technical writers or your documentation team to manage. And it's very important to keep track of decision making when it comes to this kind of content, just in case internal content is decided later down the road to become external or vice versa. It's important to understand why those decisions were made and make sure that you're not maintaining the same information in two different doc sets for no reason. However, when in doubt, always, always, always do what benefits the external user. I say that the external user will always take precedence because they lack that direct access to additional clarifying context, namely the people in your organization. So it's more important that the documentation for external users is as clear as possible. Also, track metrics as it pertains to implementing the feedback that you are obtaining from your internal and external audiences. So pay attention to the effects of implementing the feedback effectively. So as a result of the internal feedback that you're getting, is there a drop in certain support calls about certain topics? Is there an increase in the use of certain features or APIs or tools? Tracking that in terms of maybe Google Analytics for your site, understanding whether calls are up for certain endpoints. All of this are ways to see how your documentation and the feedback that you're implementing is having a positive overall effect on the org at large. So when you're updating your documentation, make sure to alert your external audience. Okay, so one way to do this is change log for documentation changes. So this could be a change log in and of itself, or this could be items listed in the overall change log that you send out to your external audience. You can also do this via social media. You can do this by blog post if the changes in documentation are sizable enough to warrant a blog post, or you can even shout out to these changes in the documentation via email updates. And last but certainly not least is tell your internal audience when you've updated your documentation as well. Just because you publish it within the organization doesn't mean that everyone automatically knows. It's important to know that updates are being made to the documentation and that you acted on their feedback because it encourages them to provide you with more feedback. So make sure to let people know, but also when you're letting people know, designate the channels that you use to let your internal audience know about these changes very specifically. So if you had, for example, a Slack channel where people are discussing the docs, making requests, it would be prudent to have an another Slack channel where it is all about sending out alerts that have to do with updates to the documentation. This encourages trust in the process and more feedback in the long run. Right, that was the end of my presentation. Thank you.